For code maintainability and to work efficiently, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code instead of Visual Studio IDE going forward to write the code for the Angular application, as we can install some extension that can help us to manage our code. So I will be using Visual Studio Code editor for the Angular application edit. So the next thing that I will do is I will open my main project, that is the CMS Core NG app, and I'll reveal it in Finder. So we'll have an option here, and all I'm going to do is drag the client app onto the Visual Studio IDE, and now I'll start working on the Angular application from this Visual Studio uh, editor instead of the Visual Studio IDE. So I don't need to stop the application running in the Visual Studio IDE. Instead, I will just minimize it and then use the Visual Studio editor. Now here we will install some extensions that will help us to manage our code. The first extension that you would want to install is go ahead and install the extension called as Prettier. Prettier is a code formatter which we can use to format our code and to maintain a formatted code in each file. So go ahead, search for Prettier and install this extension. You can find more information about Prettier on the following website. Now once you will install Prettier, the next thing that you would want to do is go back to your project, and then here inside your project we are going to add a JSON file for the Prettier settings. So I'm going to go to the client app here, and I'm going to add a new file. So I'm going to add a new file, and I'm going to call this file as .prettier. So that's the name of the file, .prettierrc.json, which will store all the settings related to Prettier. So let me rename it. Here in the .prettier.json file, once we have installed the extension for Prettier, we can go ahead and specify the settings that we need in each file. So here I have specified that I do not need a trailing comma on every JSON array that I create. I need a tab width of 4 indents and so on. I need a semicolon to be automatically added at the end, and a single quote instead of double quote in my entire application. I'll save this. Now the next thing that I want to do, I'll go to the Visual Studio Code preferences, then I'll select settings. Here I will type in settings in the search box, and here I should see the edit in settings.json. I'll click on it. Here you you will see this emit settings in your file. Here just above the emit settings you will add the following JSON, which is editor.default formatter, and you will change it to the Prettier Visual Code, and you will add the option to format on save to true, and the editor.format on save for JavaScript to true. So this particular JSON string that I have added over here, I will provide it in the video description so you can copy it. All you have to do is add this to the settings of your Visual Studio Code so that you can use Prettier as your default code formatter. Then once you close this, you can go to your source folder, open any of your files. So like in this case, I'm going to open the login.component.ts file. Since I have set single quotes to true while formatting my files, so as soon as I hit Command Save on Mac or Control S on Windows, the Prettier extension will format my file and beautify my code. So I'm going to do Control S or Command S, and as you can see that the code is formatted and I have single quote instead of double quotes in the entire component file that I have created. So one of the reasons to use Visual Studio Code is because I can add many of these extensions that I want, and I can make my code prettier and format it. And there are many other extensions that you will find that you can install and use. So I recommend you to use Visual Studio Code while you're building your Angular application, because we'll have to write a lot of HTML, a lot of CSS, and we would need to format this code accordingly. So if I go and format the CSS file as well, when I do Control S on any file, I will be able to see the formatted code. So now let's go back and work on the registration page. So if I go back to the registration component.ts file, here I need to work on this registration component.ts file. So we are going to implement this country drop down. So for that, first thing I would need to do is create a service that will communicate with the backend API in the Angular application. So we'll go and open a new terminal window in Visual Studio Code. Here in the terminal window, we are going to run the following command that will create a service for us. So I'll type in the command ng generate service. This is the short form for service S, and I'm going to create it inside services folder, and I'm going to call it as country service. So I'll call the service as country. And then I don't want any spec files to be generated that I saw in the register and login component when I created it. So I'm going to say skip tests equals to true, which will skip the creation of this spec file, and I'll hit enter. So I should see a services folder created in my application with the country service. Now here I see some errors, and these errors are telling us that there's some support for decorators is a feature that is subject to change in future. So we need to set this flag in our tsconfig or jsconfig to remove this warning. So to fix this issue, what I can do is I can go to code preferences, and I can go to settings. I can search for the settings file. I can just type in settings and I can click edit the settings.json file. Here we have the edit settings.json file. Here I'm going to just add another flag, which will be JavaScript implicit project config experimental decorators is equal to true. I will save this, and if I go back to the country service, I should not see this error anymore. So if you find the same error, the experimental error for decorators, then you can fix it by specifying this one line in your settings.json of your code, Visual Studio Code. I will specify, or I will provide the entire JSON string in the video description so you can find it easily and update your settings file. So now the next thing that we want to do is inside the country service, we first need to create a interface which is for our country object. So let's go ahead and create it, ng generate interface. Call this interface as country, but we want to create it inside a folder called as interfaces, which will hold all the interfaces in our application. Call this as country, and then we will hit enter. Now we should have a folder called as interfaces with a interface called as country. In the country interface, we will add the required properties that will form a country. So here I'm going to add the states, flag, ID, name, and 2-digit code of the country. This is the data type of each of this property. And if you feel to add any other properties that you need, like phone code or anything else, you can add it here as well and expand this interface of country. So now the next thing that I want to do, go back to the country service. Here I'm going to create a country list URL, basically the URL that I will use to call the endpoint, the API endpoint. So here I will add this URL. I'll call this URL as country list URL. This will be a string, and it will hold a string that is basically the endpoint that I want to call. So API version 1 country controller, and the method that I'm targeting is get countries. If I go back to the application, here we have the country controller. The method that we are targeting is get countries. Okay, so this is the endpoint of the call. Now here we need to make an HTTP request. So we need to instantiate an HTTP object. So we will create an HTTP client object, and here we also want to import this HTTP client. So we will add the import statement, import HTTP client from at Angular common / and here we can use HTTP. So this will get rid of the error. Next thing, I will go and create a method called as getCountries that will be responsible for fetching the list of countries. Now we need to store the list of countries whenever we fetch it for the first time so that we don't make a call on every page refresh. So therefore I'm going to create a observable object called as country, and I'm going to, this object will basically store the list of all countries. So it's going to be a country array. I need to add the import statement to this interface. So I have added that. Now this error should disappear. Next thing that I want to do is check before I make the call in the getCountries method. So I'm going to do an if statement over here, and I'm going to check if we don't have a country object. So if this is null or it's not instantiated, it doesn't have a value, then we will go ahead and fetch the data from the API backend, else we will return the country object if we have the data. So basically I'm trying to do here is if we have the data in cache, we will return it. If we don't have it in cache, we will fetch the data from the API endpoint. So if we don't have the values, we will call the HTTP object, make an HTTP request. It's a GET request that we are going to make because the endpoint that we are targeting is having an HTTP GET protocol. We supply the URL that we want to target as the parameters of the HTTP request, and we pipe the response. So we have used share replay and map operators over here. The share replay is basically used to cache the values. So any response that we get over here, we are going to cache it. Also, if you hover over share replay, you will see that it has some additional parameters like the buffer size and window time. So basically can be used for specifying how long you want to store the cached value. In this particular request, I don't have a limit, so I'm just going to store the values, the list of countries in the cache. So if you want to play around with it, you can test it by specifying certain values over here and trying to play around with it and trying to see if the values get deleted after the certain period of time. But for now, first we will share replay the response, and then we will assign the value of the response to this observable object that we created, and we will then return the result. Now the next thing that we want to do is consume this country service. To consume this country service in registration, we need to instantiate this country service. So we're going to private country service, and we are going to call the country service. So we'll have the import statement over here. Next thing also we want to do is when we save this particular file, now our registration component is not going to be displayed. We are going to get an error because a country service uses HTTP client, and our app module needs to add the reference or to the HTTP client module because we are injecting the service. And if we don't have HTTP client module injected, it cannot find it, so we cannot use it. So make sure we add HTTP client module to the import statement or to the import array where we are importing the required modules to different components. Here is the HTTP client module, which is part of Angular common HTTP. Once we do this, we should not see these errors, and we can then go back to our registration page. Now in the registration page, here we want to display the list of countries. So going back to the registration component, I'm going to create two objects, one called as the country object, which is going to be an observable. So I'll call this observable, and it's going to be type country array. And another object I will have the countries, which is just going to be list of countries. It's not going to be observable, it's just list array of countries that I'm going to display on the registration form because I need an array, not an observable type here. So the next thing, I'll create an extension method called as load countries. Now this method will be called when after we have set the background image. So we will call it over here in the ngOnIt method so that it is initialized. It initializes within the component. Next thing that we want to do, we want to assign the value of country service dot get countries. That's the method that we just created in the country service to this observable object over here. Next, what we do is we will subscribe to this observable object. So country dot subscribe, and whatever country list result we get from this subscription, we will assign it to this countries country array that we have created. So country list, and what we can do is we can also console.log to see that we have received the values. Okay, so we can do this after we have assigned. We will check if we have assigned. So as soon as I hit save, since I'm calling it in the ngOnIt, I should see some values being displayed here. So if I hit save, so as you can see, as expected, when this component was initialized, the HTTP call was made. So if I go to the network tab, I'm not seeing an HTTP. Okay, I'm seeing an HTTP call over here being made, and I can see that the get country service method, the response is being called. So now if I go back to login and if I go back to registration, you will not see the get countries method being called once again. That's because we have cached these values. If I go to about and go back to registration, I will still see only one single call. That's my initial call. That's because we have assigned the value over here in the country service to this observable, and we are checking if the country service, if the country observable already has an value, and if it does, then we use it. So if we don't have this method over here, return country, so if you're not checking this, for example, I remove this, put it outside this block, and just have to do this and hit save. What this does basically is if I go back to home, go back to registration, and you will see another call is made, an HTTP call is made to the backend. So every time you switch components, you go back to registration, you will see that there's an HTTP call made. So we don't want this multiple calls to HTTP being made to our backend. So that's why we use this particular trick where we save the value inside an observable object. And so when we switch between components, only once we have made a call, and then we load the values from cache using share replay. So I hope you have now understood why we use share replay and how we cache the values. So now let's go back to the registration component, and here in the registration component we need to display this list of countries that we have now stored inside this country variable. I'm going to remove this console.log statement. So now we need to display it over here. So we have to go to the HTML of the component that we have created. So here you see the select country drop down that we have created. Right now it doesn't display any list of countries. Here we are going to run a for loop using ng4, and using ng4 we will run a for loop on the countries array that stores all the country names. So here we are going to create a option list with the name of countries. So let's go ahead and create it. So here we will create a option list. I'm going to use ng4. I'm going to run a for loop on the countries array, and we are going to set the ng value attribute over here to store the value for this option that the user will select. The value will be the country's 2-digit code, and then we will display the name of the country in the drop down. I don't want to store the name of the country in the database. Therefore, I'm using the 2-digit code. That because the name of the country can be lengthy, whereas the 2-digit code, as we know, is only 2 characters. So we are limiting the amount of space that will be taken up in our database. Here we are getting an error saying that we cannot bind the ng value since it's not a known property. If we just had to use the regular value attribute, we would not see this error. We are using ng value attribute because we are using reactive forms, building the registration form using the reactive form programming. And reactive form, to use reactive form, we have to import the reactive forms module. So in the app module.ts, we will import reactive forms module from Angular Forms. We will save this, go back to the register HTML, and we should not see any errors now. Now we will have to save this file. Now when we save this register component file, we will not be able to see the registration component. Whenever we go to the registration component, we will have some errors, and these errors are caused because we are using a reactive form module within a form. So within this form, and this form, we have not yet instantiated this form as a reactive form. And to do that, we will go to the register component.ts. First thing that we want to do is create a form group object. Let's call it register form, and it's going to be of type form group. So we will import this from Angular Forms. Save this. Next thing, we want to instantiate this form group in our ng-onIt method. But before that, we want to instantiate the form builder object of private fb form builder. So we will instantiate the registration form using the form builder object, so we can instantiate all the properties within the form. So in the ng-onIt method, first thing that we want to do, instantiate the form. So register form group is equal to the form builder object dot the group method, and here we need to specify all the properties that we want to instantiate within the form. For now, we will just instantiate an empty object and save this. We will still see the errors. We will not be able to access the registration form. We need to do one more thing before we get rid of the error, that is go to the registration form module form component, and here we will use the form group attribute to specify that this form is the registration form group, part of registration form group, which we have instantiated using form builder. Now when we save this, go back to registration, we should not see any errors, and we should be able to see our forms, and we will see the list of countries that we are fetching using the country service endpoint. Now the next thing that we want to fix is, if you look at the finished project, I am showing the, when the register form loads, I'm showing the selected country option as selected, and it's being the default option being displayed in the drop down, whereas here I have the first country being selected by default. I can fix this by just performing a simple attribute addition over here, that is selected, and if I save this, I should now see the selected country option by default being selected and displayed in the form. So now we have successfully added the country list to the form where the users can select this form. The next thing, if you look at the finished project, we have the reactive form implementation for the errors, which is if an input is touched and the field is then left blank, then we specify if the input field is required. So we need to display errors in our form while the form is being filled or while the form is submitted. So any errors, we need to display it over here as we show at the bottom of the form. We will do that. So the next thing that we want to do is display errors. So for that, first thing we need to do is instantiate all the form inputs that we have, all the properties that are going to store these values. We will have to instantiate them. as part of the form builder group. So let's go ahead and do that. Here I have added all the required properties that we would need while we are building this registration form. So let's start with the error list. The error list will be used to store all the errors that we will have in our application or in this registration form. So we'll store it into this error list array, and then we will use it to display the errors on the model that we will be creating. We use this string here to display the model message and the title of the model. We have set a flag called as is registration in process to false. We will use this flag to show the loading loader or the spinner while the registration is in process. These are the form controls that we have on our form, like the username, first name, last name, and so on. These are part of form control data type, so you would have to import it over here in the import statement from Angular Forms. These are all the properties that we will be using for building this registration form. Now, as I mentioned that we are going to show the errors on the model, therefore we need to install SweetAlert. We have used SweetAlert in the backend of the admin panel to display messages. So we are going to use SweetAlert in the front end as well. And to install SweetAlert in our application, we will use the terminal window and we will run the following command, which is npm install SweetAlert. So there are different versions of SweetAlert. So we want to make sure we install SweetAlert 2 because that's the package we have used in the backend as well. So we are going to install it in the front end for our Angular application. We'll hit install. We'll hit enter, and now Angular or the npm node package manager will install it in our current project. So SweetAlert is now installed. To make sure it is installed, we can check the package.json file, and we should have an entry for SweetAlert in the package.json file. Here we have the entry for SweetAlert. So that's the version that was installed, 9.17.1 at the time of recording this video tutorial. So now let's go back over here to the registration component. Here, first thing that we want to do in the registration component, we would want to go ahead and instantiate these form control objects that we have created. So we need to instantiate them. So we can instantiate them like this. So for example, for the username, we can instantiate using the new form control. And here in the constructor, we could specify the form state as empty for now for this particular object to set the initial value. Then we will specify the validators for this particular property. So validators dot first thing that we want to add in the validators is this particular property is required. So we will say validators dot required. So any property on your form that you want to be set as required, in the validators you will call the required method or the required property on the validators class, and you will specify it over here. Next thing that we want is to limit the number of characters for the username. So how much we want to set the max length. If we don't set the max length, then users can enter n number of characters for the username. Therefore I want to limit the number of characters. So validators has another property over here called as max length, or method called as max length. In the max length, we can specify the number which is going to be the max length of your username. So I want the username to be 10 characters. Let's make it 15. No, I'll just leave it 10 for now. You can change it accordingly. Validators, then we will have a validators for minimum length as well, because we want minimum length of for a username, and the minimum length I have set it to 5. So in this way we can instantiate the form control uh, objects that we have created over here, and once they are instantiated, we can then use them in our form. So let's instantiate the remaining form control objects. So here I have added the remaining form control objects that need to be instantiated. If you look at the uh, form control object for email, I have used a new method here called as email. So validators also has an email method which can be used to validate if the string is in valid email or it's not in valid email. So we have confirm email, password and confirm password, which I have instantiated. The country, if you look at the phone number, I have used a different validator over here called as pattern, and here you can specify the regex string regular expression. We can also use regular expression, and I have used a regular expression to validate the phone number. So based on your country or your state, you can change this regular expression. Go on Google and search for the regular expression for the phone number to your specific country, and if you don't want to change anything, you can just use this string that I have used, the regular expression. So for the rest of the properties over here, I have set it to required. Now there are a few more things that we need to do for email and for password. If you look at the form, the email and the password should have two input values over here. For example, email needs to be entered and then the user needs to confirm their email. For password, the user needs to enter the password and confirm their password as well. So which means the input from the first input field should match the input from the second input field. So we need to create a function that we can use that will match the value from the specified input field to the other input field that we want to match it to. So to do that, I'm going to create a common service that will help us to achieve this. So here in the terminal window, I'm going to run a command ng generate service. Inside this services folder, I'm going to create another folder called as common, which will hold all the common services, and I'm going to create a validator service. I'm going to set the skip test flag to false. Oh, skip test to true, sorry, and then hit enter. Now we should have a folder inside services called as common with a validator service created for us. Inside this validator service, I'm going to write the code that will help us to match the first input to the second. So here I have added a method called as must match, and this method takes the form control as a parameter. So we are going to specify the form control. In our case, it's going to be the first control that we want to match to the second control. Here we have done some validation checks. We are going to return a boolean. So we are going to return null, we are going to return true, or we are going to return false. So the first check that we will do, if the first control and the second control have not yet been initialized, then we return null, that we know that the form is not yet been initialized. If the validator already found an error in some previous input, then we don't need to validate the uh, inputs over here, because we already have an input error on the other field, so which basically means that the form is not valid. So we'll not spend time validating these two inputs. Now finally we check if the first control does not match the second control, then we will set the error on the not matching control. So we have created this must match validator method, and we have to make sure that it extends validator fn so that we can use it as a validator method over here inside the form control property. So the next thing that we want to do, now we have created this validator service, we need to consume this service inside our constructor. So let's go ahead and consume this service or instantiate this service. So here I have instantiated this service, created an object of type validator service, called it validator service, added the import statement. Next thing, to use this must match method inside the input of form control, where you want to use this must match method to validate the control. So I want to use it on the confirm email, because here on this particular form control I want to match the value to the primary email input. So using the validator service, I call the must match method and pass in the first control value, which is email, in this case for confirm email. For confirm password, it will be the password, which is the first control, so I've passed it over here. As soon as we pass the value, the validation method will use this must match method and perform this check using the following logic. And if it returns false, which basically means that these controls have no errors. So now I will go ahead and I will save this. Saving this, as you can see that the code is being formatted due to the Prettier extension that we have installed. And I have to scroll down. So here the next thing that we want to do, we have now instantiated these controls. Now we have to make these controls the part of the form group that we are building. So let's go ahead and add these controls to our form group. So here now I have added the properties or the controls that we have just instantiated to our form group, and we have set the values for each form group property to the associated form control. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this. So now we will go ahead and check the form that will make sure that we don't have any errors. If you notice that when I hit save, the quotation marks disappear. That's because Prettier is trying to organize the code based on the settings. If you don't want these quotation marks to disappear while you're creating an object like this, in this particular case, you can change the Prettier settings in the Prettier settings file. But for now, I will leave it as it is. So go ahead, save it. Now we will go to the form itself, and here, how does the form know that this particular form control value, which is, for example, in this case username, should be taken from. So we have a username form control over here. How does this form control know that this username value should be taken from this username over here? And to do that, we are going to set an attribute called as form control name over here in this particular input field, so that the object, that is the form control object, knows that it needs to fetch the value from this particular form control or this particular input field. So now I will go ahead and add this value over here. Now you can see that the form control name attribute is added. So now our form control username, which is in our registration component over here, knows that when it needs to get the value of the username, it will get it from this particular form control, because now we have specified the attribute form control and the value as username. So username value here, as we have set in the form builder, will be assigned to this username over here. Now let's go ahead and add all the form control attributes to the remaining input tags as well, or to the remaining fields as well, or in our form. So here I have added the form control name attribute to all the fields that we have in our form, and I will leave this code in the GitHub repo, so you can go ahead and go through each of the input fields and you will see that the form control name is added. We'll not spend time going and explaining each and every input. I just explained it to you that whenever we want to map the values to the appropriate form control, we have to set this form control name. Now the next thing that we want to do, this button, this registration button, we want to disable it until and unless the form is valid. And to do that, all we have to do is on the registration button that we have created over here, the register button, we are going to set a attribute called as disabled. When the registration form, which is our register form, which is part of the form group, is invalid, we will set this attribute to disable, to be true. So by doing this, the disable attribute will make sure that the form is not submitted until and unless the form is valid. So we can save this now, and we have added all the form control names. The next thing that you want to do is display these errors at the bottom of the div over here when the form control are selected or touched. So let's go ahead and implement these errors. So here after the form control button, I had a row created with a column. Over here I have added all the errors that I need to display. As you can see, I have added the error. I've added an ng if condition over here to check if the username control is touched and it has any errors. And if it has any errors, then display the errors on the div. Similarly, I am checking the validation errors for other input fields, and based on the input field's error type, for example in the case of phone number where we are checking the regex, so we are checking if it has any error related to pattern, then we will say valid phone number is required. So accordingly you can arrange, and accordingly you can set the messages that you want to display on each error tag. So I'm going to save this now so it can be formatted. Now the next thing that we would do, now after saving this file, when we go to the React form or to our form, if we touch the input fields and then if we see, we will be seeing a displayed error on the screen. This is done through reactive forms programming, and as the error suggests that these fields are required. So in the case of the password, if the password field has any errors, like the max field, the max length that is accepted is 5 characters over here, so we will not see the error as soon as we enter 5 characters, but as soon as we enter a different confirmed password, we should see an error that the password does not match, and this is done through the must match method that we created in the validator service. So now we have successfully implemented reactive form. We have made this form reactive by implementing errors on touch and showing them. So the registration button will not work because the form is invalid. So we also have not set any functionality for the click event of this registration button. So the next thing that we also want to do now is go ahead and work on this submission of the form, because the UI part pretty much is now complete with reactive uh, form implementation. Now let's go ahead and do one final thing that we need to fix on this form is the date of birth here. So in the form that we see over here in the finished project, you will see that I have a calendar that is shown when the date of birth input is selected. This calendar is created using jQuery UI. You are free to use your own npm package or any other uh, library that you want to use to make show this calendar, but I'm going to use the basic jQuery UI, and for that I have to install it. So I'm going to go ahead and install this jQuery UI uh, uh, package inside this particular uh, project. So let's go ahead and now install the jQuery UI package. So to install the jQuery UI package, we'll open our terminal and type in the following command: npm install jQuery dash UI dash dist, and then hit enter. So it's npm. Now the node package manager will install jQuery UI dist distribution in our project. We also need to install the typed version, so we will install npm install at types jQuery UI so that we can use it using jQuery within the component itself. So I'm going to hit enter. So both these packages are now installed. The next thing that we want to do is in the angular.json file, we need to reference this particular library. In the angular.json file, in the styles array, we will add the reference to jQuery UI min.css file for the styling of the datetime picker. And we will also reference the jQuery UI min.javascript file, which contains all the method and functions for the JavaScript datetime picker. So these two references, once added, we can then go to the registration component.ts, and here in the registration component, we need to instantiate this datetime picker when this particular component loads. So to do that, after the countries are loaded, I'm just going to use some jQuery over here to do a callback function which is going to instantiate the datetime picker. So this is basically a callback function to know if the document is ready, and if the document is ready, then we go ahead and we will instantiate the date time picker in our application. Now we will target the ID of the uh, date time picker element. So in our case, it's a date time picker. I've set the ID as date picker. So if you go and look for date picker in the HTML file, you should find it over here. So the input has an ID of date picker. So I'm targeting the ID to instantiate this particular element or input field as a date time picker input. So here I've called the date picker method of the jQuery UI, which will be used to instantiate the datetime picker. You can set the year range. I've set it from 1920 to 2099. You can set it accordingly as per your requirement. Users should be able to change the year, the month. So I've set this value to true. And when the date is selected, the DOB, that's the date of birth object property of form control, we will set the value to the selected uh, date that was selected in this particular datetime picker. So that's all we have to do over here. Now we see this error here on the datetime picker. If you hover over the error, you will see that the property datetime picker does not exist in jQuery HTML element. So we have installed the types version of the jQuery UI library. We also need to add it to the tsconfig.app.json file as we did for the jQuery types. So in your tsconfig.app.json file, go ahead and add the reference to jQuery UI because we have already added the types. Once you have added the types, we install the package. We can add the jQuery UI, the name of the type library, and then go over here. We still see this error because now we have to import declare the jQuery over in this component. So what I can do is just below the last import statement, I can add a statement, say declare let dollar is equal to any. So by doing this, what will happen, we will get rid of the error, and we will also see uh, that the datetime picker is loading fine. So now I can save this file. Okay, now I can save this file, and once I save this file, I should not see any errors, but I can also see that I don't have any errors on the console. Now if I go and select the inputs, I should see the errors as expected on the errors div that we have created because the reactive form is working as expected. And as soon as I go to the date of birth input, I will see the jQuery UI element, jQuery datetime picker, sorry, being instantiated, and I can see the calendar that I can use. So I've set the date range as I told you. So you can increase or decrease the date range depending on your requirement, and we can select the dates like this. So once we select the date, we can then see that the birth date error is also disappeared because we have selected the date, it's not blank. So now the next thing that we want to do is, after we fill out this form, we need to submit this form, and then when we submit this form, a new registration should take place. If the user's email is already registered, then we should throw an error saying that the email is registered. So we have to do error handling, we have to register the user. So we will do it in the part 2 of the registration component build that we are building, because this video tutorial is already become very lengthy. So we will divide this video tutorial into two parts. In the next part we will finish off on the registration component, because we will also need to create a method in the service that we can use to register the user. So we will do that in the next video tutorial. For the code that we have used in this video tutorial, you will find it in the video description. The DevOps repo link will be provided. If you have any questions, use the comment section. I will be happy to answer your questions. And please do not forget to like and subscribe our channel and this video. Thank you once again.